To the Lord in July 1979 and 1971, sorry. I came to YWAM in 79. I came out of a very dark background in terms of I was part of the radical youth counterculture of the 1960s and early 1970s. I was a member of a Marxist-Leninist cell in Toronto, Canada. I grew up in Canada. And I was also deeply involved in the occult. I became a priest and a high priest in the occultic, not a Satanist group, would be closer to what today would be called Wiccan, but still witchcraft and still dealing with unclean spirits. And so when I came to the Lord in 1971, God broke into my life very dramatically. And I teach on worldview. I tell the whole story because it says a lot about worldview in it, but we don't have the 2 hours for that. But what it meant was that worldview mattered to me. It wasn't an issue of intellectual curiosity. I had worldviews that were diametrically opposed to the Bible. I had worldviews that were, they were occultic. I'd been an atheist at one point. I sought revolutionary change for the issues I saw in society. Why were those wrong? I was Marxist. I was concerned about injustice. Why was Marxist answer wrong? In the occult, I was dealing with spirits, the spiritual realm. Why was the occultic view in the spiritual realm wrong? It wasn't just intellectual curiosity. I needed to think these things through. History has also always been a passion for me as long as I can recall. And so as I've matured in my faith, I realized I needed to begin to rethink history from a biblical perspective, from a biblical worldview. And so what you're seeing is actually pretty close to 50 years of reflection on God and history. And so to begin, I start with 3 presuppositions I think we as believers need to have when it comes to history. One, that God, this Trinitarian God of the Bible, is a sovereign Lord of history. He is working in history to see his kingdom come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's not just his will be done after Jesus comes back. It's not just his will be done on earth. God is working to see his will be done in human history. My second presupposition is that God's primary agent for accomplishing this is his people, the church, you and me. And history moves towards God's purposes or away from them, depending on the obedience or disobedience of God's people. We'll look at examples of that as we go through history, where God's people have been obedient to his call, is obedient to fulfill the Great Commission, to preach the gospel, to serve the poor, then the kingdom has advanced. Where God's people have been disobedient, we've seen significant setbacks for the church. My third presupposition is a missiological presupposition. that God has given distinctive gifts to all nations and peoples of the earth. And history is the field, history is the place where those gifts are being discovered and developed. Drawing on the picture of the book of Revelations 21, where it says, the kings of the earth or the lords of the earth bring their gifts into the heavenly city. And or bring their treasures, the treasures of their peoples into the heavenly city. And those treasures aren't gold and silver. And those kings are you and I. We, as the people of God, humanity has been given authority, dominion over this earth. So we bring the treasures of our nations into the heavenly city. My life is being shaped by books. I love books. I have a couple thousand in my personal library, and that's real physical books. I have a couple thousand more on my computer. Two books in particular shaped my view of history just in a distinctive way. I read both of them before I was a Christian. The first of them was the Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. And Tolstoy, read in time when I was an atheist, gave me a sense there might be meaning in history, which was a very strange thought for an atheist, but it was just a sense that all these events might mean something. And the other book was J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Again, it might seem an odd thing. Here's a fantasy book. What does that have to do with history? Again, I was an atheist when I first read it. And the thing that struck me as I read it in a very dark time in my life. I was suffering from depression. I was bullied growing up that led to depression. And yeah, just feeling of hopelessness. And Tolkien gave me a sense, or gave me a sense there might be hope in my life and hope in history. Again, for an atheist, very strange ideas. Or why can you have hope in history when history is meaningless? So those are two key influences in terms of shaping my view of history, in terms of, when I then became a believer, I came with already a sense that there is meaning and there is hope. Now, it wasn't until after I became a believer that I discovered that both of these men were Christians. Tolkien, a believing Catholic, Tolstoy from the Orthodox tradition, though he was somewhat heretical in his views. One other series of books that shaped my view of history, and also I don't know of any other writer who approaches history the same way as I do, is a man named Thomas Cahill. He's written a series of 7 books. Well, actually, he's written 6, and the 7th I'm still waiting for him to finish, called The Hinges of History. That's the name of the whole overall series. And what he says in the introduction to the series is, we normally think of history as one catastrophe after another, war followed by war, outrage by outrage, almost as if history were nothing more than all the narratives of human pain assembled in sequence. And surely this is often enough an adequate description. But history is also the narratives of grace. I love that. History is also the narratives of grace, the recounting of those blessed and inexplicable moments when someone did something for someone else, saved a life, bestowed a gift, gave something beyond what was required by circumstance. In this series, The Hinges of History, I mean to retell the story of the Western world as a story of the great gift givers. Those who entrusted to our keeping one or another the singular treasures that make up the patrimony, the inheritance of the West. This is also the story of Western sensibility, a narration of how we became the people we are, and why we think and feel the way we do. And it is finally a recounting of those essential moments when everything was at stake, when the mighty stream that became Western history was in ultimate danger and might have divided into 100 huge, useless tributaries or frozen in death or evaporated altogether. But the great gift givers, arriving at the moment of crisis, provided for transition, for transformation, and even transfiguration, leaving us a world more varied and complex, more awesome and delightful, more beautiful and strong than the one they had found. So we'll be looking at some of these gift givers. Some of them are Christians, some of them are not Christians, but who've contributed to the richness of our world. Cahill, again, is a believer. He's a Irish American Catholic. And that shapes his whole view of history as well. And he talks about the gifts of peoples. You talk about the great gift givers. So with that introduction, let me go to the first people, and I'll shape it to some this week somewhat around the different peoples of the world and their contributions to history. Now, my specialty is Western history, and to those of you who are non-Western, those of you who are African or maybe elsewhere, my encouragement to you is that while I'm approaching it from mostly a perspective of Western history, we need to think through all of history in this way. So my question will be to you as you listen this week: where do you see God working in your history? And I see we have some from Africa, from Nigeria, is that right? Some Africans. Where do you see God working in Africa's history? I'll be teaching in 2 weeks in Burkina Faso and bringing a sense of history, international relations there. Where has God been in the history of Africa? What are the gifts in your culture? So what I hope to do in this week is also not just teach or give you a model for thinking through how to approach history wherever you live. The first people we're going to look at are the Greeks. Now, I have always loved the Greeks. As far back as I can recall, the Greeks fascinated me. When my parents bought an encyclopedia, I remember the first thing I looked up was a history of the ancient Greeks. And that love has continued. I love their stories. I love I love Greek food. There are also serious problems with the Greeks, so we'll cover those. But we're going to begin looking at contributions of people in Western history with the Greeks. And I'd like to begin with a quote from a Christian philosopher, theologian Gordon Clark, who wrote, "The history of philosophy began on May 28th, 585 BC at 6:13 in the evening." Now, that's a very unusual way of stating when philosophy began. How can you tell? How can you date the beginning of philosophy down to the very minute of 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago? I wonder if anybody could take a guess at what kind of event might have allowed us to date it so precisely, or him to date it so precisely.
A certain person was born at that time?
That's a good guess, but we wouldn't usually be able to date it to the minute. Such a precise thing. This is literally, we know exactly when it began. Or what kind of event can we date down to the very minute, even after 2,500 years? Well, let me tell you the story of Thales. He's considered by historians to be the first Western philosopher. He's born in 624 BC. The Greeks, like all the nations of the ancient world except Israel, worshipped many gods. These gods were immoral and vindictive. They committed adultery, they killed humans without any feeling bad about it at all. They merely wanted their own will. They're selfish, they wanted what they wanted. They were arbitrary, they just did as they wanted, when they wanted, and they were unpredictable, not caring what humans were hurt as they got their way. Another thing about these gods, though, is that they were finite. They're limited in power and knowledge. They could be hurt and tricked. One of the things I found helpful for giving people an idea of what these gods are like was the Marvel superheroes in the Marvel movies. That each god had his own superpower. Zeus, who's the king of the gods, was the king of lightning and thunder. Poseidon was the lord of the ocean. Apollo was the god of the sun. Mars was the god, or Ares in the Greeks, was the god of war. Each god in a special area where they had which was their superpower. But they were limited, they were finite, they didn't know everything, they weren't all knowing. They weren't the creators of the world. In a sense, according to the Greeks, the world is eternal and also revealed the will of the gods. So if you saw a meteor, that might mean it was predicting the fall of the king. This was a world that Thales was born into. He lived in the city-state of Miletus, which is just off the southwest coast of present-day Turkey. He was a teacher, and there are indications he is also a military engineer. I like Thales. I relate to him in some ways. There are some stories which indicate he was a typical absent-minded professor. There was once he was walking through a field and so busy thinking about something, he wasn't noticing where he was going, and he fell into a well. He had to be rescued. He loved to learn. That's another way I relate to Thales. He loved to learn, and he was able to acquire the Babylonian charts of the heavens. Now, if you know, think of biblical history, if you think of the Babylonians, they were astrologers. They studied the stars and their movements. They studied all the different events in the heavens to try and predict the will of the gods. They thought that the movements of the things in the heavens predicted the will of the gods. So Thales was interested and acquired their charts of the heavens and was studying them. And in the midst of his study, Thales thought he recognized a pattern, and that his recognition would change the world. On the basis of this pattern that he thought he recognized, he predicted a solar eclipse. And that's what happened on that evening. I like to picture what it must have been like for him. He's predicted this eclipse. It seems he actually made his prediction known to some people. So as a teacher, his reputation was on the line. And he's sitting there, and it's 6:13 in the evening, so things are starting to get darker. And then the evening gets darker still as the shadow of the moon moves across the face of the sun. And Thales, seeing that, realizes, I've done it. I've done it. I've done what no one else has ever done before. I predicted a solar eclipse. What was unique about Thales, he also had the wisdom to know what it meant. It meant the universe makes sense. It operates by predictable natural law, not the arbitrary will of the gods. What happens in our universe, the movement of the stars, and by implication, the events on our world, in the natural world, are not just the gods messing with us. It's the world operating according to predictable natural law. And that meant it could be observed by people, understood by people, and predicted by human reason. It's foundational to science, the development of science. And ultimately, even, say, the modernism as we conceive it, which views the world as being a wholly rational world, is based on the same kind of observation, or the same type of realization, though taking it too far. It brought to the Greeks a sense of enormous freedom. You can imagine your life has been built around this fear of offending these selfish, arbitrary gods, that if you offended them, they could do something very nasty to you or kill you. And all of a sudden, realize the events in this world aren't the outworking of these gods, but they're something that's natural law, and we can observe it, understand it, and use it to work in this universe. Reason became an idol to the Greeks because it was so powerfully liberating at first. Thales is an unusual man. He recognized that the universe was connected in this way so that the parts work together so they could be observed and predicted. Then it must be made of a common material. He thought that common material might be water. And given the physics of his day, that was actually a very good guess, that water is the only material in our world that in its natural state exists in all three forms of matter. That matter consists of solid, liquid, or gas. Only water can exist in all three states. So you have ice, you have solid, you drink liquid water by drinking flu medicine dissolved in water, and you have gas when you boil it. Again, that insight that everything in this world must be made of a common material was an amazing glimpse ahead to 20th century physics. Because 20th century physics, modern physics, tells us that this is true. Do you know the famous formula that tells us that this is true? Albert Einstein put forward the formula E equals mc squared, which means energy equals mass of something times the speed of light squared. Now, I don't really understand what that means in terms of how that works, but what it means is that energy and matter are essentially interchangeable. You can turn matter into energy, and in theory, you can turn energy into matter. We turn matter into energy all the time. We do it when we light a fire and burn wood. We're changing the matter of the wood into the energy of heat and light. In theory, can turn energy into matter, but we do not have the means to do that at this stage. But in principle, energy can be turned into matter. The result of this insight, discovery by Thales, was an explosion of discovery. Realizing that the universe can be observed, understood, and predicted by human reason allowed human reason to be applied to understanding this world. The Greeks particularly interested in the field of mathematics and made some unusual or new discoveries in that field. But it wasn't long before they ran into problems with this new understanding they had. The next Greek thinker we're going to look at is Pythagoras. And many of you have probably studied Pythagoras in high school geometry, high school mathematics. Pythagoras lived from 580 to 500 BC. You ask a question, what is the difference between music and noise?
Well, there's a rhythmic order to it. There's a goal behind it.
Okay, rhythmic order. How else but you describe that? What would be behind that rhythmic order?
Purpose.
Purpose. And what would be the, how would that be worked out? Or how would that be described in another way?
Math.
What?
Math.
Hey, exactly. Musical notes are in a mathematical relationship with each other. I find that brilliant. Jen, an indication of the way God has created our world. That mathematics is the most rational, logical discipline in that there is. And yet it underlies music, which stirs our deepest emotions. It touches us so deeply in our hearts, that raises our hearts in worship to God. That in God's universe, emotion and reason are not against each other. They're meant to complement each other and enrich each other. And music is, in some ways, one of the best demonstrations of that I know of. You see that also in terms of actually Thales' insight in terms of the solar eclipse. I said that his fundamental insight was the universe makes sense, which he's talking about the philosophical idea, and they say he's the founder of philosophy, but he got that insight from an astronomical observation, an astronomical prediction. Philosophy, science, astronomy are not opposed to each other. They're not separate. They're all part of the unity of God's creation and the unity of knowledge. Many people have said that all truth is God's truth, and all truth interacts and is connected. So Pythagoras was the one who discovered that music can be described mathematically. It was a wonderful insight, very brilliant man. So you see, his life overlapped with that of Thales.
Yeah.
They may have met, though Pythagoras was significantly younger. But Pythagoras is also famous for another discovery of his. Do you know what that is?
Pythagoras theorem.
Right. And can you describe that?
It's
A,
yeah.
you know, a squared plus b squared equals c squared.
Right. In terms of literally the in the square in a right triangle, meaning the triangle which has an angle of 90 degrees, the two sides, the square of the two sides added together is equal to the square of the hypotenuse, the other side. This is very useful in certain kinds of actual things in the world. If you yeah, it was guessed at by the Egyptians and the Babylonians. We know enough of what they were doing to know that they must have known about it. But what Pythagoras did was he provided a mathematical proof of it. That's because the Greeks were so profoundly into mathematics that they discovered the proof. So in a triangle where you have one side is 3 meters, another side is 4 meters, so it's 3 squared is 9 plus 4 squared, 16, means the hypotenuse is 25. But what happens if one side of the triangle is 1 meter and one side, and the other side is also 1 meter? What is the hypotenuse? What is C?
Also 1 or 2? 2. Sorry.
Yep. Okay. It's 1 square. It's 1 squared plus 1 squared equals the hypotenuse, which is the square of the hypotenuse, which is therefore what you have is a square root of 2. Do you follow that?
Yes.
But what is the square root of 2?
4. Oh, sorry.
What multiplied by itself equals 2?
Nothing.
There's no number, there's nothing that multiplied by itself equals 2. It doesn't exist. If what you call it mathematics is you have an infinite regression. If you start to calculate it out, you just go out to infinity. You never reach the actual number because it doesn't exist. But that creates a problem. When you have a triangle with 1 meter and 1 meter, and it's there, it exists, but it can't exist, it doesn't exist. We today still call these numbers irrational numbers. And this will sound strange to you. This would throw Greek civilization into a crisis. It took time to build, but the end result was a crisis. Because the question was, or the issue was, they had been delivered from an irrational kind of world dominated by these irrational kinds of gods, to a world where we could understand it by human reason. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of their newly rational world, in the most rational discipline, mathematics, they discover the irrational. So the question is the world rational or is it irrational? And this question would fester in Greek philosophy and ultimately affect its whole society. As it wrestled with the question, is it possible to know truth? Because that's what it would eventually come down to. Is it possible to know that some things are true? Is there such thing as justice and goodness? Are these real things or are they just words? We'll look at the process, but they never would find a solution to this dilemma. Their worldview did not have a place for a solution. To the Greeks, the universe had to be rational or it was irrational. The root of the problem is the problem of universals versus particulars, unity and diversity, the one and the many. If the universe is fully rational, then it's totally predictable. Everything in it is predictable, including human thought. There's no room for diversity and freedom. The universe is fully irrational. If it's fully diverse, then there's no order and only chaos. So, as Greek philosophy developed, there were attempts to try and resolve the tension. The next person to really reflect on this was Heraclitus of Ephesus. He was born in 500. We're not sure of when he died. Heraclitus saw that, okay, we see rational here and we see irrational. Life in this universe is maintained by keeping these things in tension. There's a continuous battle on between the rational and the irrational, in which neither side could win a final victory. It was just always this tension. It was a law of, he talked about the law of flux, that everything changes all the time. He's famous for the statement, you can't step into the same river twice. Because if you step into it once and then step out and step into it again, the water you originally stepped in has gone. So it's a different river. You're stepping into the river, change the mud on the bottom of the river. It's not the same river. So everything in this world is constantly changing, but what gives it order? And he introduced to the world a word to describe this, which one New Testament writer would pick up on. So if you think, you hear this, remember, this is the background in which it comes from. He said the rational principle of the universe, which gives some kind of order to this world of flux or constant change, the rational principle is the logos. When John used this word, he used it with very real awareness of its background in Greek philosophy. You had some people who struggled with, if everything is the same, if everything is ordered, predictable, if everything is one, then change is impossible. So you had one say things change all the time, the other saying change is impossible, which means motion is impossible. So you had two people, Parmenides and Zeno, who came up with a number of riddles to prove that motion is impossible. Democritus, reflecting on the nature of the universe, his major insight didn't have to do with this particular debate, but he said that you can take a stone and break it in half, cut it in half, take that half, cut it again, take that, cut it again, take that half. You can keep on cutting and cutting and cutting, dividing it until you get to something which cannot be divided. And he is the first person to suggest the existence what would become known as atoms, which is actually, it's literally what atom means, is indivisible. By the mid 5th century, so we started off in 585, so that's early in the 6th century. So a century and a half later, many had given up any pursuit of truth. The sophists were a group of philosophers who arose in Athens. Athens, now to give you some move to broader history, which has taken place. Athens went through a political revolution in the late 6th century, and a tyranny was overthrown, a tyrant was overthrown, and they instituted democracy, a completely democratic society, meaning that every citizen could vote on every law and every issue, that everything was done by referendum. There was no popular elected assembly to make laws. Every citizen could vote on every law. Now, it's good to know when you think about democracy, that, as I say, it meant every citizen could vote. Women were not citizens. Only men could be citizens. Yeah. Slaves were not citizens. So the actual, at this very optimum number, there's never more than 25% of people who could vote. But this was a political revolution. Nothing like it had existed, as far as we know, up to that time, where any kind of resemblance to democracy existed. The historians have said there's only one other people in the ancient world which had something similar, and that was the Jews. They've drawn real parallels between the Greeks and the Jews. In the nations around them, the king often was viewed as being a god incarnate. He was a god living among the people. Pharaoh was a god. Nebuchadnezzar was a god. They were worshipped, and they were the place where the gods mediated their will to human society, and they themselves were related to the gods, the son of gods. And so you had the king who had absolute power because he was king, or because he was a god. And then you had the nobility who basically served the king in order to carry out his will. But the people were just subjects to the king. They were there to do his will and nothing more, which actually reflects something of their view of the gods, because in their view, the gods had created humanity to just serve them and meet their needs. So in the midst of this political revolution, being able to present your case, to be able to speak persuasively, became very important. If you want political power, if you want to have influence in your city, you have the right to speak at these gatherings where laws were passed. But if you're going to make a difference, you had to be able to speak well. A group of teachers arose in Athens, which was the intellectual center of Greece, called the Sophists. It's a word based on the Greek word Sophia, wisdom. They're saying, we are the wise ones. But the Sophists basically came to the conclusion was, we've been arguing about whether there's such a thing as truth, justice, goodness, beauty. We've been arguing about these things for a century and a half, have got nowhere further. Obviously, we can't find the answer. So what matters isn't justice, what matters isn't truth, what matters is having personal power to shape the world, to shape the city the way you want it to be. And we will teach your children, the influential citizens of Athens, we will teach them the art of rhetoric. We'll teach them to speak persuasively, to persuade people to vote for what they want. We will teach them how to give it, in modern days, how to give spin to what you want to do, how to make it sound favorable to the city, even though it's what you want. So let me set this within its historical context. This period of time is what's known as the Golden Age of Greece in history. If you hear about the Golden Age of Greece, it refers to dates approximately 480 BC to 430 BC. About 50 years, that's the Golden Age of Greece. What set the stage for the Golden Age of Greece was a war with the greatest world power of its day, Persia. And Persia wanted to subdue Greece to its rule. And it launched two invasions, one in 470, or one in 490 BC. And one in 480 BC. And the first invasion was not successful. It was just driven off by Athens. The second invasion, the Persian king Xerxes, just a matter of biblical reference, he is the same king as Ahasuerus, sometimes called Xerxes in the book of Esther. He gathered a huge army, at least 250,000 people, to march on Greece. And Greece was small. There was no one nation of Greece at this point. It was all a collection of hundreds of small city-states, each independent, each having its own laws, its own army. And the population was relatively small compared to the Persian Empire. This huge army marched on it. Have any of you seen the movie 300? Okay, it's a story done in a very mythicized style, maybe. Excuse me. Done very mythic kind of style to of the stand of 300 Spartans to try and resist this army at the pass of Thermopylae. They were defeated. Persian army reached Athens, burned the city to the ground, but Athens had developed a navy and evacuated its populace to the island of Salamis off the coast of Greece. And then that navy engaged the great Persian navy, and the Persian navy was destroyed by the Athenian fleet. And the other great Greek power, Greek city-state, was Sparta, who were foot soldiers. Athens had navy, Spartans were foot soldiers. And they led the Greek coalition against the Persians in 579, completely defeated the Persian army. Now here was a fringe society on the edge of the civilized world. I mean, Greece wasn't hardly thought about in the great power politics that had to do with Assyria, Persia, Babylon, Egypt. These are the great powers. Greece was just a tiny, unimportant group on the fringe of the empire, and yet it had defeated the greatest empire the world had seen. An empire extended from Turkey all the way to India. And this set the stage for the golden age of Greece, a time of confidence, a time of creativity and beauty. The Acropolis that's there today in Athens was built during this period of time. But Athens and Sparta, as the Greek city-states had always been, were always suspicious of each other. The city-states, as I say, each had their own laws, each had their own armies. They were often at war with each other. They united together to stop the Persian invasion, but as soon as the Persians were defeated, they went back to their old rivalries. And Athens, because of its success in leading part of the war against Persia, began to develop a more powerful empire of its own, uniting other city-states together to support it. Sparta was doing the same. And what happens when you get two enemies, each of whom are building up their own military power? Yeah, they begin to get suspicious of each other, more and more suspicious. And eventually in 432 BC, open warfare broke out between Athens and Sparta. Now, warfare between the Greek city-states was how to put it, it tended to be short and sweet. Well, not sweet, but they were not extended wars. The second Persian invasion lasted over a period of 2 years, and that was a long war by Greek standards. But usually what happened, armies would go out, they'd fight over a piece of land, and the army that won took the land. And what came to be known as the Peloponnesian War, named after the area that Sparta controlled, lasted for 30 years. And as it went on, was increasingly brutal. There was a time of plagues, of sicknesses that devastated Athens at one point. Excuse me. The violence between the Athens and Sparta grew and grew. And it used to be if you defeated an enemy, you just took something from them. It began to happen that when Sparta defeated an Athenian army, they would enslave or slaughter the populations. When Athens would defeat a Spartan ally, it would enslave or slaughter the population. It was increasingly brutal war. and the moments in the war when peace might have been made. You had these people who had been trained by the sophists to stir up the people, saying, no, when Athens had the upper hand, no, we have to, now's our chance to destroy Sparta. Now we have to win, when Sparta was offering peace. And they stirred up the passions of the people, stirred up the passions of the mob, and no peace was made. Basically, the same thing happened in Sparta, that they weren't dealing with the sophists. When peace was possible, and Athens wanted peace, the Spartans said, now is our opportunity to get rid of Athens once and for all. So this went on and on and on for 30 years. We will look at how one man began to respond to that and pointed in a direction for Greek philosophy and thought and history that Paul would take up on later on in the New Testament. So it's 10:15 and we have a 20-minute break, I believe.
Yes, I think we take a 30-minute break and then please be back after 30 minutes. Thank you, Ibadan. It's good that you joined and thank you so much. Okay. Yes.
Excited.
Please. Thank you. Let's take a break. You remember, I'm glad.
Okay, so we've been looking at some Greek philosophy, Greek history, and we've been seeing how tensions of philosophy around the question of rationality and irrationality, which has implications for, does truth exist? Does beauty exist? Does justice exist? Really is a foundation for answering the question, is the world rational or not? They're all connected. We saw Greece reached its peak in terms of its military power, defeating Persia, it's a period of wonderful cultural flourishing. The Greek drama comes to its height in this time. But at the center of Athenian civilization, particularly the intellectual center of Greece, there is a moral rot. As the leading thinkers, the sophists, have come to the conclusion we can't know whether there's any such thing as goodness, beauty, truth. What matters is power, and how to manipulate people, how to use the arts of communication to manipulate people to gain power for yourself. This we saw would lead to a disastrous war. In the midst of all of these, one of the great intellectual leaders, thinkers in human history arose, a pioneer in many ways. Socrates, born in Athens in 470 AD, so just shortly after the end of the Persian War, 9 years later, and lived through this period of the increasing power of Athens, the culture, the architecture, the art, all these things are flourishing during Athens' golden age. And he began as a sophist. He began with the raising questions about whether it's possible to know truth, goodness, beauty. But he came to recognize that no society will long endure unless there is some kind of truth, founded on, unless some kind of justice is being done, unless we recognize beauty. Athens needed virtue if it was to survive. He was popular among the young men of his day, and probably would have been young people, but women were not allowed to participate in such public life. He was always followed by a group of disciples who would follow him through the Athenian marketplace, where people would meet, discuss. Same place. Later, Paul would go to in Athens, and it was a place where discussion often took place. And Socrates was famous for asking questions. He had a view of humanity that somewhere in us we knew the truth. And therefore, if we asked the right questions, if we kept probing, we had the potential for allowing each person to discover the truth that's in them. So he would wander through the marketplace, asking questions, asking uncomfortable questions. One of the questions he asked was, would you want your children to grow up to be like your gods? So the Greeks continued worshiping their public gods, even though they'd gone on with the whole development of reason and philosophy. The gods were still worshipped. And Socrates knew the character of these gods, and he said, do you want your children to grow up to be like them? He often would say that I'm the wisest man I know because I know nothing. Others think they know something, therefore I'm wiser than they are. He said the unexamined life is not worth living. He recognized how important it is for us to give thought, consideration to what do we believe, what do we value. We need to examine our lives. He saw the disaster that Athenian democracy was leading to in the war with Sparta. He saw how it was inflaming the passions of the mob. So he began to have serious doubts about Athenian democracy. Athens would ultimately lose the war. It would, its power would be broken, and it would never fully recover from what it was. It lost the war. It was a disaster for the city. And many Athenians felt that Socrates, because of his anti-democratic sentiments, was actually a sympathizer with the Spartans and therefore a traitor. So he was put on trial, though he wasn't tried for that. He was tried for corrupting the minds of the youth. So by asking such awkward questions as, do you want your children to grow up to be like your gods? And the other accusation, I wonder if you'll recognize how much it sounds like something else. The other accusation was he was teaching strange gods. Does that sound like another somebody else you know or have heard of?
Jesus.
Hello?
Jesus.
Jesus.
Yes, well, some of these actually use this word almost exactly the same in the New Testament.
Paul, right?
Oh, well, Paul doesn't use it. It's used about Paul, which gives us an indication that what's happening there with Paul was not as innocent as it appears, that it was a serious offense. And I say Socrates had been executed for it. it looks as though Paul and Luke are setting this whole thing up to point back to Socrates. There are other indications that we'll look at. Now, it has to be said that we actually have no direct record of Socrates' teaching. He wrote nothing himself. Everything that we have comes from a couple of his disciples, mostly Plato, and also Xenophon wrote a few things. One of the Greek playwrights incorporates incorporates Socrates into one of his plays. But from Socrates himself, we have nothing. He chose not to write anything down. He felt that if I write it down, people will distort it. If I say it, I am here to correct any distortions. Of course, after he died, that didn't help. But Plato faithfully reproduced what his teacher had taught. Now, actually, so much so that we don't really know for sure whether what we're getting is Socrates or Plato, because Plato puts everything, all of his teaching, into the mouth of Socrates. And it's Plato's actually an interesting person to read in terms of there's a dynamicism in his writings. It's not like reading a text in philosophy. It's a group of friends who are together and they're walking through the marketplace and discussing issues, or they're at a dinner party and discussing issues. So there are a number of French films, particularly, that are around friends having dinner and having discussion around the dinner. Plato's dialogues are very much like that. It's a group of friends, Socrates and his pupils, sitting together, walking together, discussing issues of goodness, truth, justice. So sometimes I might say Socrates, and sometimes I might say Plato, and really it doesn't make any difference because we don't know actually for sure who said what. There's good evidence that Socrates is real, and good reason to suppose that Plato was faithful in terms of what he recorded. Plato lived from 427 to 348 BC. But let me quote something from his most famous work, The Republic. In this book, Plato is seeking to put forth a plan to order a just society. They say this is one of the places where you see that Socrates is challenging Athenian democracy because of the disaster it's led to. Actually, while Socrates was teaching, the war was still going on, but you can see that it was leading to disaster. And so in one scene in The Republic, Socrates and his disciples are walking through the agora, the marketplace, and they come across a sophist. And Socrates, doing what he does, asking questions, he asks, what is justice? And the sophist replies, justice is fulfilling the law. So justice is obeying the law, and if someone breaks the law, justice is enacting the penalty of the law on him, because there is to a sophist, justice does not exist, or at least we can't know it. Socrates pursues the question with him of, is there such a thing as an unjust law? And after some back and forth, the sophist concedes that it's possible to have an unjust law. As the discussion develops, one of Socrates' disciples, not Socrates himself, but one suggests what would happen if a truly just man ever lived and walked in this earth. And this is the description of the just man in the Republic. Let him be the best of men, and let him be thought the worst. Then he will have been put to the proof, to the test, and we shall see whether he will be affected by the fear of infamy or the fear of man and its consequences. Is he being the best for the sake of being the best, or is it because he's afraid of people's opinion? Let him continue thus to the hour of death, being just and seeming to be unjust. I'll tell you that the just man who is thought unjust will be scourged, meaning whipped, racked, bound, will have his eyes burned out, and at the last, after suffering every kind of evil, he will be crucified. Now, some of what we read here obviously isn't true to what happened to Jesus. He wasn't put on a rack. He didn't have his eyes put out. But the other details are so explicitly graphic that it makes you pause. Like, this is an amazing insight that Socrates, Plato had in terms of what would happen, what did happen to the only truly just, perfect man who ever lived in this earth. So early Christian writers, the church fathers, actually called Plato and also Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle pre-Christians. They felt that what they were writing, what they were teaching, was ultimately pointing towards Jesus. It's one of the things that God placed in the culture. So how do you then develop a just society? Say Socrates had strong problems with what he'd seen in the democracy in Athens. Plato is writing this in the shadow of the lost war with Sparta, trying to make a sense of the disaster in Athens history. And let me make a point that often you'll find the greatest philosophers are not people sitting in an ivory tower thinking about what's the meaning of life. They're people who are grappling with some serious issue in their day, sometimes a disaster, trying to make sense of it. With Thales, it was the discovery of the Babylonian charts of the heavens, and then out of that, the discovery of the universe with Socrates and Plato trying to make sense of the disaster of the war with Sparta that had destroyed Athens so badly. So what was Plato's answer? Building on some of the thought that had gone before, but giving it greater strength and foundation, he taught that the world we live in is only a shadow of the real world, which is the world of forms or archetypes. What we see in this world is only a copy or shadow of the real thing. I'll give an example. What kind of animal is a German Shepherd?
Intelligent.
The dog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
What kind of shepherd? What kind of animal is a Chihuahua?
Dog.
You're kidding, right?
Greedy.
I mean, how could this little yapping, hairless thing compare to this graceful German Shepherd? How could they possibly be the same thing?
I'm thinking.
Because they're both shadows. Let me tell you what is probably the most famous parable in Western culture outside the parables of Jesus. That's Plato's parable of the cave. And Plato's parable of the cave, which is told in the Republic, is we are all living in a cave. All humanity is living in a cave, and we are fixed so we can only look in one direction at a wall. Behind us is a fire. So the shadows simply can be cast on that wall. And things from the real world outside the cave come down into this world and pass between us and the fire. So their shadow is thrown on the wall of the cave where we can see them. But all we can see is the shadow. We cannot see the real thing. So what we see in this world is a shadow of a dog, and shadow, its size and shape can vary with the angle of the light, different factors. What we have in this world is only a shadow of justice, only a shadow of truth, only a shadow of beauty. They're not the real things, but the real things exist in the world of forms. The real things exist in the cave, outside the cave. And Plato suggests that the philosophers could, in giving consideration to the nature of truth, in contemplation, they could escape from the cave into the real world, see what the real things are, and come back and tell the rest of us. Therefore, he proposed that instead of democracy, where everybody is just seeing shadows, that we create philosopher kings. We create, our rulers will be kings who are trained in philosophy, trained to go outside the cave to discover what truth and justice and beauty are. And so he proposes an educational system for Athens. It was never put into effect in the purest sense, but he proposes a system which will seek out those who have the gifts and talents and ability to be the philosopher kings, the rule of the wise, the rule of a wise elite to decide what are the best laws. Now, that might sound a little bit abstract, but let me give it some application in terms of education. This is a fundamental idea lying at the root of much of Western education. That the role, the purpose of education is to identify an elite who will be best suited to rule. So you have elite institutions, elite universities that prepare the elite to be rulers. In the United States, the people who are the leaders in government agencies, representatives, senators, Many of them have gone to the exact same elite institutions and schools to prepare them to be the rulers. Not just everybody, usually, who's in those places. There's a high percentage who've gone to institutions like Harvard and Yale. It affects us because our educational system is set up to identify an elite who will be the ruler. It tends to overlook people who don't fit the mold. And many YWAMers don't fit the classic academic mold of our institutions. So they felt they've been educationally wounded by the schooling. They've been left out because they don't fit that mold. The system is set up to exclude those who are not going to be the best. Now, a friend of mine went to a Swiss university, and he said that on his first year, his first day of his first year, his professor told the students, look to your right and look to your left. In a year's time, only one of you will be here. 2/3 of the class would automatically be excluded. Now, there's nothing wrong with seeking to identify skills, to identify abilities, and people who don't have abilities for certain things. It's best they go where their abilities are suited for. But it's more the intent that lies behind the educational system that has been wounding to many people. What Plato suggests in terms of the world is that we live in a world there is a rational world, what he called the world of forms or archetypes, and and there's a world of what he called matter. And that's confusing to us because when we think of matter, we think of something solid, the world around us. But the Greeks used the word matter to describe chaos and flux, constant change, no laws, no predictability. So the irrational, the matter represents the irrational in the universe. So you have the world of form, which is rationality. You have the world of matter, which is the irrationality, constantly changing. And where they intersect is our world. That the world of form imposes some order and rationality upon the irrationality of matter in our world, which allows our world to exist. What's the significance of that? The most important thing that is there, because it sounds very abstract. What's in form, matter, what's it about? What Plato was indicating, what he was pointing to, was look back. If there's to be such a thing as such things as truth and justice and beauty, if these are to be real things, there must be something beyond our world. Now, he never claimed as personal God. For him, personal gods were the Olympians, the gods of Olympus, and they were immoral. But if this world is to make sense, if this world is to be rational, there must be something beyond it. Now, Plato was a pupil of Socrates. Plato also had a famous pupil, Aristotle, and Aristotle lived from 384 to 322. Aristotle could not really, didn't agree with Plato in terms of the forms were in a whole other realm by themselves, a separate realm. He thought the forms only existed in the things that we see. The form of the dog only exists in real dogs. It was there that means that form and matter come together, not in no concept. But then you're left with the same problem. Plato suggests an answer to the problem of the irrational by saying that there's something beyond this world. Aristotle gave the same answer a different way. One of the gifts Aristotle gave to us is the rules of logic. People all have always used logic, of course, but Aristotle detailed them. He gave them out. You can Google the rules of logic to see that they're intellectual tools to help us understand, help us evaluate. Aristotle logically demonstrated, well, yeah. One of the things that came to us from Thales and the idea of a rational universe is that we live in a universe of cause and effect as part of the rationality of the universe. We can predict it because certain things have a cause, and they're a result of a cause. There's a cause that went before them, and something caused that. Aristotle demonstrated that you cannot have an infinite chain of cause and effect. That's true cause and effect. If that's so, then there must be a first cause that was not itself caused. It's sometimes called the unmoved mover. So sometimes we called the unmoved mover. There has to be a first cause, something that started everything that was itself uncaused. Again, that's saying that the original cause is outside of our world. If there is to be such thing as rationality in our universe, there's be such things as truth, justice, beauty, there must be something beyond our world of cause and effect. Aristotle was a scientist. At least he's been called the first scientist because while he was interested in understanding how this world works, he studied nature. Well, at least he thought about nature. He tended not to experiment. He would just think what would be logically true, relying on human rationality. An example, if you take a 5-kilo ball and a 10-kilo ball and drop them from a height, Aristotle said, well, the 10-kilo ball is heavier, then therefore it will fall faster than the 5-kilo ball. He never tested it out. He just, this sounds logical. So people assumed that that was true until actually Galileo tested it and found that actually two balls of different weights fell at exactly the same speed. But he was interested in the world. The world was worth studying for its own sake. Um, Aristotle had the opportunity that he hoped building on what Plato had thought of in terms of the philosopher kings. Aristotle had an opportunity that he thought might be looking to an answer for that. He was asked to come to the king of Macedonia in the north of Greece to tutor the son of Philip II of Macedonia, the king. The son would grow up to be Alexander the Great. In many ways, Alexander was a serious disappointment to Aristotle because while a very gifted man, a very brilliant man, brilliant general, brilliant administrator, he was utterly ruthless and thoroughly ambitious, believing himself to be the son of one of the Greek gods, son of Zeus, the chief Greek god. So his one aspiration for the philosopher king was a serious disappointment and failure. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had rescued Greek philosophy from the irrational by looking, saying, there must be something beyond this world, something that embodies truth and justice and beauty, something that began this world. But they could go no further. Plato's archetypes were not a personal God. Aristotle's unmoved mover was not a personal God. It was only a glimpse of the truth. That if there was to be a solution, if there was to be truth, justice, beauty, there must be something outside the system of cause and effect. There's little serious development in Greek philosophy from them. There were other thinkers. We'll look at them briefly in a moment, but they've continued basically in lines that had been set either by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, or by the sophists. What were some of the other contributions that came to us from the Greeks? First is the idea of citizenship. People are not just subjects of a ruler, but they're citizens of the polis, citizens of the city, able to share in the decision-making process of the city. This was true to some extent, even in the cities that were not democracies. So citizens had a voice in the government of the city. Then there was democracy. It was, they say, outside of Israel, which had its own forms that were suggested democratic principles. It was the only ancient civilization where any kind of democracy as we know it existed. Say very limited, but still revolutionary in its day. In Greece, you had what we call a citizen army. Probably similar in many ways to what you have in Switzerland, that every citizen should bear arms, should be able to bear arms, and would continue in weapons training for during their whole until as long as they're physically able to do so. So it was a citizens' militia, not a standing army in the traditional sense. The other side of Greeks, and I've said I have a great admiration for them. I've said some very positive things, but there were the other side of Greek civilization. One of the consequences of their form and matter dualism is dichotomistic thinking that we still wrestle with in Western civilization, that as it developed, the idea of form would represent spirit, and the matter would represent this world, and spirit represents rationality, matter represents irrationality, and therefore certain jobs are superior to other jobs. So being a teacher, as I'm being, is a superior view in much of Western society than a manual laborer. Completely at odds with the biblical integration, which sees all of life as valuable. Every calling is valuable. Rest in the Greek is under a Greek view of the world underlies that. This leads to a being versus doing, feeling versus thinking. We see so much of this in the church, that just follow your feelings, or not just church, all of Western society, follow your feelings. It also leads to, on the other side, leads to a rationalist theology, which is often eliminates the possibility of the miraculous that came into Western theology. That I said the miraculous is no longer present with us. God doesn't do miracles. God doesn't give prophecy. Those are miraculous things ceased with the apostles. The rationalist theology grew out of the development of Greek theology within the church. The negative view of women in the church grew out of this. The church was profoundly influenced by Greek thought. They said women could not be citizens, except in Sparta. That was an exception. But in most Greek cities, women could not be citizens, and they were felt to be inferior. On the basis, what I said in terms of form and matter, you have an idea why that might be the case, that women were felt to be inferior. Was that just noise, or did somebody answer? I can't.
I don't think anybody said anything.
I'm not sure.
Well, in terms of, if you think about rationality, what does 2 plus 2 equal?
4,
What does 4 plus 4 equal?
8.
Will it ever equal 9?
No.
Will it ever equal 7? Truth is unchanging. Truth remains the same. The realm of form is unchanging. Therefore, what changes least is more akin, is more like the realm of form than that which changes more. And women change more than men. And in what way do women change more than men?
Emotions. Emotions.
Emotion? Yes, but something that's more, some men are quite emotional and some women are quite rational. What is a way that a woman changes all regularly?
Menstrual cycle.
Menstrual cycle, which is also like the cycle of the moon. Almost the time is almost exactly the same. It's always been noted that that's true. And the moon changes. So the things that change are less like the form of the things which stay the same. So therefore, women are inferior to men. And that was the Greek view of women. That's why women were kept from, well, yeah, it developed in terms of it, but women were viewed as being less than men. That also led to a positive view of male homosexuality, which was fairly common among the Greeks, because it was felt that the ideal sexual expression was form to form, male to male, not male to female. So there's ideological homosexuality. It doesn't mean that they were homosexual in terms of, as we often think about it, in terms of that's part of their identity, but were, because they, Greek men married, had families, had children, but the role of women was to have children. The role, sexual pleasure was often found in male and male homosexual relationships. There's developed a legalism in Greek thinking, and this would affect the Hebrews later on, because they felt that they could trick the gods, because they could seemingly agree or seemingly make a bargain with the gods and then get out of it by a legalistic manner. Give an example. There's a city of Sicyon was besieging Ornai. Ornai made a vow to worship Apollo at Delphi with a procession and sacrifices every day if they were preserved from being captured by Sicyon. So indeed, the siege was lifted, they were saved, and they kept their vow to Apollo by having a relief carved on a wall in Olympia, the holy city of Greece, of a procession with a bull. In terms of having actual procession with killing a bull every day somewhere would be an incredibly expensive thing to do. So they just had a mural made. And that supposedly fulfilled their pledge. There's a legalism what it's saying, what suggests to me is what the Pharisees practiced in the New Testament when Jesus talked about Korban, that they were, Korban was where you seemed to be obeying the law, but actually you were finding a way around the law. There's indications the Greeks influenced Hebrew, part of the Hebrew world, well, the Jewish worldview at that time. The Greeks were also racist. They called other people barbarian. And the word that our word for barbarian actually comes to us from the Greeks, barbaros, and it was meant to make fun of foreign speech because it sounded to them like somebody stuttering. So barbarian. They viewed themselves as being superior, not because they were technologically more advanced. They recognized that the Babylonians and the Egyptians were very technologically advanced. But they considered themselves to be superior because they were free. They weren't subject to god kings. They were citizens. Two other philosophers who set the stage for later. Epicurus. He lived from 341 to 270. Epicurus taught that the purpose of life is pleasure and to avoid suffering. He felt that there was no need to be concerned about any gods. If there were any gods, they're not interested in us. He was basically a thoroughgoing materialist. In terms of his pursuit of pleasure, it does need to be said he didn't mean that you could go out and get drunk every day, or because if you do that, you're going to destroy your liver, which will lead to a great deal of pain. So the purpose of life is to maximize your pleasure. So that means you have to avoid excess. In fact, the expression moderation in all things comes to us ultimately from the Epicureans. He was one of the heirs of the sophists. There is no truth, justice, beauty. The other school of thought developed out of from the stream of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It's called Stoicism. It was founded by Zeno of Citium, the city he was from, around 301 BC. It believed that there was a moral character to the universe, that we were created to have sympathy with one another, and that there's a real sense of truth and justice which we can strive towards and attain to, or strive towards anyway. They stressed living ethically in accordance with the logos, reason. So it wasn't selfish, the goal wasn't pleasure, it was to follow what's right in accord with the logos. We'll meet both of these groups again. Now, I've covered a lot of ground. Are there any questions? I want to say also, if you have questions along the way, feel free to raise up your hand. no, Zoom, it's not always easy to do. I don't see you very well, and you're far away from the camera, but we could try and do as best as we can. So are there any questions so far? Observations? Yes.
I'm very interested in what you said, in there being a higher value of certain types of work and in doing over being. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit in terms of how, kind of the repercussions of that nowadays that you perhaps observe?
I missed the very first beginning of that. So.
I was very interested when you were saying that in Greek society there emerged this thing of, seeing certain types of work as superior to others, and therefore doing became better than being. I'm just interested if you observe what you observe in that, any consequences for nowadays.
Yeah, well, in the church, I've numbers of times, in fact, probably many times, had people in our church home in the States saying, I admire you so much. You live by faith. And I was I'm glad I was discipled by a man who said we're all called to live by faith. That missionaries, faith missionaries, are called to get their income from gifts, and faith should be involved in that. But every person in every profession every Christian is called to live by faith. And Paul's words, "We walk by faith, not by sight," were not directed to an elite who were missionaries or even an elite who were leaders in the church. It was directed to every believer. That means, in terms of believers, that we I could not do the job I did, the calling I did when I was dean and now as a teacher, without a thorough reliance in God, the Holy Spirit. There are just times in my life as a leader where I've been absolutely unable to go forward without working together with God in it. But that isn't unique to Christian workers. At least it shouldn't be unique to Christian workers. I know of doctors who have a very clear sense as they're doing diagnosis, as they're looking at the data that they have for when they're diagnosing somebody. And there's always an element of human judgment in terms of evaluating that. But they all say, Holy Spirit, show me what's here. I could expand that in terms of, but it's also true in terms of for non-Christians. Again, partly you see it in terms of how it's Plato's idea, the philosopher kings, has influenced our educational system. Some people are higher, some people have a higher calling, some people are superior, and we need to identify those as being those who will be the ruling class. So it's what do we value in terms of each human, each person is created in the image of God. One of the things that means that each person is created by them with gifts, talents, destiny. I have a handicapped son. He had a hemorrhage in his brain 2 days after he was born, and it's left him with, he has a spastic form of cerebral palsy. He's mentally limited and physically limited in what he can do. When we first found out about that, we were absolutely devastated. It felt like somebody had taken our son and left someone else in his place. All the dreams, hopes that we had were gone. It was a full year after it happened that he was finally diagnosed. So we had a year thinking we had a normal child with some issues, then found out to be a very different life. And one of the things that I remember, I was feeling so absolutely depressed by it, and God spoke into his situation. He said, Christopher may be handicapped, but my purposes for him are not handicapped. And that suddenly gave me a sense that not only were God's purposes for Christopher not going to be frustrated by his handicap. In some way that I couldn't understand, God would use the handicap, fulfill his purposes in Chris's life. Now we've seen that develop. He's a man now of 34 years old, and he can share with people that I could never reach. He has a boldness. He shares about his faith. He talks about his faith. So I don't know if that gives you some idea.
Thank you. I have another question, if that's okay for time.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm also very curious. You were saying that, yeah, in your pursuit of truth, or being fascinated by history and reading all of these things, what was the rationality or the time of your life where you went from being a high priest Wiccan or Satanist, where obviously the big kind of quote for that is "do as thou will." When did that change from then to then realizing there must be a rationality and there's something more? Or
Yeah. I'll tell a bit of the story. Can't go into the whole lot. That part of my life, I was a priest. I was a priest that served several different spirits. At least that's what we thought. And looking back, I'm not sure exactly how many spirits were actually there. We talked about 9 primary ones, but it could have been a couple masquerading as 9. But part of our life as a priest was worshiping these spirits, was serving them. And there came a point, and this the real turning point for me in terms of coming out of that was when, through a series of events, we became aware that these spirits had lied to us. That was a very disturbing thing. These were real beings that we interacted with on a regular basis. We obeyed them. We thought we were serving good with them. And yet they had lied to us. And that was, yeah, very disturbing in terms of asking the question, is there a hidden agenda? What are they really doing? And that made me and us begin to back off from it. Not completely, we were still stayed involved in some ways, but to a lesser degree. And then the other people in my group, we were living in Toronto, Canada at the time. The other people in my group moved out to Vancouver, and I was going to join them later. And in the summer of 1971, I was planned to hitchhike out to Vancouver. That's how hippies got around. And one of my friends talked about a friend she knew. She said that he has a lot of spiritual wisdom. And I said, oh, I need to talk to somebody like that. This has really confused me. So I wanted to meet him. And she said, well, unfortunately, all I know is that he's somewhere in Western Canada right now, but I don't know where. Now, Western Canada is it's like saying somebody's somewhere in Western Europe, even larger than that. So how on earth do I find this guy? But I knew I wanted to. And so when I started hitchhiking, I set out with the intention of finding him. And then the first thing that happened was that I got the most unexpected ride in a time when it's very difficult to hitchhike, and people are taking weeks to travel to my first destination, city of Winnipeg. I got a ride in 40 minutes nonstop. Went down to the park in Winnipeg where the hippies hung out, and a hippie girl walked over and sat down, talked to me, and says, "You remind me of my brother." And I thought, well, that's cool. She started talking about her brother. And the more she talked about him, it sounded like Mike, the guy I was looking for. So I said, look, your brother's name is Mike Connolly, is it? And she said, well, yes. How do you know? From her, I found out he was with the Jesus people in Calgary. Now, that was not a positive thing to be. Jesus was not a positive thing. I did not like Christians. I'd met many Christian evangelists on the streets, and I actually loved to provoke them. I would challenge them with areas where the Bible seemed to contradict itself, and found none of them I talked to had thought through any of that at all. And so I would poke, want an answer. And they would get upset. I had one Christian evangelist get so upset with me, had his Bible in his hand, he took it and hit me on the side of the head. I'm the only person I've met who's ever been literally bashed with the Bible.
Oh no.
So Jesus people did not sound positive to me, but something was happening. There was a ride that got me there. This girl, I remind me of her brother, who just happens to be the guy I'm looking for somewhere in Western Canada. find out from her that he's with the Jesus people. Got to Calgary, another hitchhiking. Again, some good hitchhiking stories, not as dramatic as the first one, but made it Calgary quickly. Went to the Jesus people's house. Mike wasn't there. They're just going to they're all going to, so we're going to Emmanuel. Do you want to come? Mike might be there. And I had no idea what Emmanuel was. But Mike might be there. I'd go. So I went with him. And I still recall a sinking feeling in my stomach as we drove up in front of this big building with a sign, House of Emmanuel, Assemblies of God Church. And I thought, I've been had. I didn't want to go in, but they promised they'd take me to the youth hostel afterwards, and Mike might be there, so I went. Sat as far back as I could. It was a combination of things that happened there that night. One of it was a supernatural manifestation of first time I'd seen it in Christians. I'd had lots of contact with Christians, but everything I'd heard up to that point was God talk. They'd talk about God, and to me and the other people in the occult, but we saw no evidence of spiritual reality in their lives. It was just seemed to us to be God talk. We knew what spiritual reality was. Now, it's the wrong spirits, but we knew it. And we didn't see it in their lives. And there's a group of Jesus people singing in tongues at the front of the church. And that was the first thing that drew me. Now, I didn't know what they were doing. I thought they were pronouncing their English badly. But it was something and it drew me. There's a beauty to it that drew me. And I think it was because the first time I saw spiritual reality in Christians. So when we sing in tongues, we speak in tongues, we're manifesting Holy Spirit. The testimonies that were shared that night spoke to me. First time I heard people talk about Jesus in a way that made sense to me. They didn't use funny Christian language here. Jesus people who'd been hippies like me short time before. And so they just used normal language without cursing that I usually did then. And it just touched me. And at the end, they gave an altar call, and I knew I had to make a choice. And I chose not to respond. All of my pride rose up inside me. And I'm a high priest. People respect me. People fear me. I'm not prepared to give that up. So literally, out of sheer pride, I hardened my heart and sat where I was. And about 10 minutes later, two of these Jesus people came over to me and just asked me a really simple question. And, do you want to receive Jesus as your Lord and Savior tonight? It takes longer to tell than it took to happen, because it happened at the moment of revelation. It was, I saw all the events that led to my being in church, where I'd never ordinarily go of my own accord. That night, eating ginger in the park in Winnipeg, the rides that got me to where I was. And then in the service itself, I'd heard a message that I wanted to respond to. But when the moment came to respond, in my pride, I hardened my heart and sat where I was. So this God humbled himself and came to me in these two young men. And it was just an overwhelming sense of the character of God. I remember thinking, if this is what God is really like, I have to get to know him. Nothing else matters.
Wow.
I literally threw myself into the arms of these two Jesus people. I was baptized that night, baptized in the Spirit. And God took me to a church in Seattle. And there I was discipled a pastor who had a wonderful sense both of the reality of the Spirit, but also of the need for good, solid foundations in the Word of God. So Francis Schaeffer was part of my early reading as a Christian. C.S. Lewis. The first serious Christian book I read was C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain. He also was very into missions. All that formed, I was very fortunate that I never, as a Christian, had the experience of dichotomy in my own life. I had that sense of the Spirit, but also the value of the mind that God's given us. And I'd be very thankful for that. Again, that's influenced my worldview.
Wow. Thank you so much. What do you mean by dichotomy?
What do I mean by dichotomy? Saying the spiritual is superior to the intellectual, making distinctions between it can be in the secular world you have dichotomous thinking too, but it has to do with what's intellectual versus, say, what is a physical job. A janitor versus a university lecturer. That's dichotomistic to say the one is superior to the other.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And in the church, that the pastor's job is more spiritual, or a missionary's job is more spiritual. Every calling in this world is anointed by God, is appointed by God. He has called each one of us to a destiny. And none is higher or lower, they're only different.
I have one more question. Maybe it's a quicker one, if you don't mind. Just going back to all the Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus. Do you have like any book recommendations for like all the Greek philosophy kind of summarized, one that kind of does a good job at combining all of them into kind of like summation of what they all are? To talk about.
What I found difficult in it, in terms of my own study, was that often the conclusions I had to come to on my own. You get what you'll study as you study most works is what did Plato teach in terms of form and matter and his basic cosmology. What its significance is, it's hard to find. Clark, who I quoted at the beginning, Thales to Dewey is one of the best. I draw on him for much of my for what I talk about in terms of the history of philosophy there. He's a Christian theologian philosopher, Gordon Clark. So Gordon Clark, Thales to Dewey. That's still available. There are many Christian introductions to philosophy. Well, I can do. I don't have a list automatically. I can right here, but what I can do is I can email it to the school and they can get it to you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thomas Cahill, who I mentioned also, his Hinges of History series, his book on the Greeks, Sailing the Wide Dark Sea, also includes that as some of it. But again, he takes an integrated approach of trying to look at different facets of the contributions of the Greeks, but the philosophy is part of it.
Thank you.
So we don't have a lot of time left this morning, so let me just introduce the Hebrews, because they're the next group. It's commonly taught, or has been traditionally taught, in that Western culture is primarily the result of Greek rationality, which we've been looking at, Roman law, and Judeo-Christian monotheism, ethical monotheism. That those are the three primary influences that have shaped Western culture. So we'll look at the Hebrews next, we'll get to the Romans. But then we'll look at the influences later. We look at, in terms of the Greeks, look to reason as a source of knowledge. The Hebrews were the receivers and preservers of God's word, his written revelation. These Romans in chapter 3:1, Paul says, "What advantage then is there in being a Jew, or of what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God." The reason we have the Bible today is that some Jews have been faithful down through history, in spite of the failings, in spite of the times where as a nation they've gone away from God. Some have been faithful to pass on to us the words from going all the way back to Moses through to the New Testament. We owe the Jews an incredible debt. And to quote Calvin, actually speaking of Martin Luther, but similarly, we owe them more than we can ever repay. This was a foundational view, that laid the foundations for the Hebrew view of knowledge. The Greeks had developed the idea the source of knowledge was ultimately human reason, and then they ran into problems with that. Ultimately, pure reason, didn't say this, I should have said it earlier with the Greeks. Pure reason proves the irrational, and that's what Pythagoras did. That was what his dilemma was. He had used reason, he had used the rational to prove the existence of the irrational. But for the Hebrews, knowledge was ultimately covenantal, relational, and revelational. That is, God reveals himself and reveals a biblical view of the world in his covenant that he makes with Israel. Initially, the first 5 books of the Bible, and then recording the history of his working with people, where we discover more of who he is, what his holiness and character mean. It's relational because the covenant wasn't given primarily just to give Israel a set of rules to live by. It was given to bring Israel into a relationship with Yahweh. So it's covenantal, it's relational, and then it's revelational in terms of it. God reveals himself in his written word, the covenant he makes with Israel. So we get one of the ways we know about God is his propositional revelation comes to us from his written revelation. There's a couple of key things there in terms of when we talk about being relational and revelational. Revelational reveals propositions about God, but where our knowledge is never to just be about God. Truth isn't first and foremost truth about God. Truth is first and foremost a person himself. We through the covenant come to know God. And that's the purpose of the covenant, to bring us into relationship. It reveals who he is. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You see this also in Jeremiah. Jeremiah probably is my favorite writer certainly in the Old Testament, maybe in the whole Bible. I love Jeremiah, but in chapter 9, verse 23 and 24, this is what the Lord says: let not the wise man boast of his wisdom, or the strong man boast of his strength, or the rich man boast of his riches. But let him who boasts boast about this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on the earth, for in these I delight. We're called to know God. That was what the Hebrews brought to us. When the Greeks considered creation, it was for the purpose of understanding and predicting it. Looking back to Thales, for the Hebrews, first and foremost, it was for the purpose of knowing the God that creation revealed. So Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day by after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they display knowledge. So the Hebrew view is that it is making God known. I think we are at the end of our morning.
Yes, we are. So thank you so much, Ed Sherman. Let's really thank you. I think you have served us richly, just not only your knowledge, but also with sharing your personal life. So thank you so much. Yes, and we will, I think, pray and close for today. Is there anyone who would like to pray, especially for his health? Looks like Catherine is ready. Yes, go on. No, it's good.
Yeah, Father, thank you so much, Lord, for this time. Holy Spirit, thank you for your presence that's been at work in each one of our rooms, although we're in different locations over Zoom. Lord, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your knowledge, for understanding Jesus, and just the way that Ed has opened up history to us and begun to expand on that as well, going from the Greeks to the Hebrews. Lord, we ask that you would just cover what has been taught to us, that we wouldn't forget it, that you would show us revelation through it, God. We just bless Ed. Lord, thank you so much for him, that he's willing to come here to teach, God, that he's teaching what you've placed on his heart and the way that you've worked through his life. We recognize that and just honor that, God. And yeah, we just pray for his health. We just command any fluey, just sickness off him in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Just command that peace and wholeness, shalom of his whole body, complete health, ability to breathe, have energy, and focus well, and just feel completely healthy. Yeah. Thank you, Lord. I just ask for complete recovery very fast in Jesus' name. And yeah, bless him for the rest of the day, God. And thank you for what's to come in the rest of the week. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Catherine. And thanks again, everyone, Kingsley and team. So I hope we all have a good rest, and yeah, we meet tomorrow.
9:15, right?
Yes.
Okay, see you tomorrow. Have a great day.
Yep.